Welcome to Complexify, where we seek to kindle the examined life for contemplatives in the world. I'm your host, Paul Swanson. Today, I'm in conversation with Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, he's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a core faculty member and dean of faculty at the Center for Action and Contemplation, where he hosts the podcast, Learning How to See. Brian has written numerous books that you should read, and right now, I recommend his latest, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. In our conversation, Brian and I talk about the desire to embody urgency and patience simultaneously in this work of life after doom, the music that has formed him, complexifying hope in dire times, and so much more. As always, you can visit Complexify.com for the show notes on this episode and learn more about Brian at brianmclaren.net. Now join me in raising a glass to my guest and friend today, Brian McLaren. I always love to begin just by asking my guest about where you are. What's the context you find yourself in today?
Well, yeah, first, Paul, my emotional context is I'm super happy because I listen to your podcast. I love it. And in fact, I've had sleepless nights thinking about how I'll answer your final questions. But seriously, I love your conversations on this podcast. I have been traveling quite a bit because I have this book release. And I just literally walked into my house about, 55 minutes ago. And after getting up at 4 a.m. to catch a flight to get home, and took a shower, and I feel refreshed. And yeah, so all is well. It's quiet here, although thunderstorms are supposed to roll in. We'll see if they can postpone until we're done.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I so appreciate the fact that you listen to Complexify. It means the world to me. And what a gift that a 4 a.m. flight is no joke, to get up that early to catch a flight. So thanks for your presence here. It's always a joy to be in conversation. I would love to ask, to kick it off, for folks to get to know you who maybe don't know you or want to get to know you better. I think of you as somebody who embodies a unique contemplative position by the way that you move and live and teach in the world. When you hear that word contemplative, how do you feel like that moniker relates to you and your work, if you think it does at all?
Nobody has ever asked me that before. Like, what do I think about the word contemplative? So this might give me a chance to think about that myself. I'll tell you one thing that comes to mind. My first exposure to contemplative was because I grew up in a conservative evangelical context. The word contemplative was always a contentious word, which might sound funny, but some of my evangelical friends had tapped into a medieval controversy on the active life versus the contemplative life, the via contemplativa versus the via activa, which I suppose was a serious debate through many centuries of Catholic monastic life. In evangelicalism, there was a parallel sort of, there was a dynamic tension between piety. A good Christian is quiet, and a good Christian prays a lot and reads the Bible a lot and moves through the world slowly and very sensitive to how much I'm sinning and always seeking forgiveness for my sins, and a deep piety that's based on remorse. That was sort of this more contemplative, pious, deep spiritual life. And then the via activa, that in religious terms might have been active, involved in evangelism and missions work and that kind of a thing. So I was introduced to this tension. And even though I'd never heard of Richard Rohr or anything like the Center for Action and Contemplation, I just remember literally being like, 18, 19 years old when I was feeling and hearing these tensions and thinking, gosh, I kind of like both of them. I'd like to, I'd like to have depth and so on. And the word mysticism was a bad word because we were very Bible oriented, and the truth we needed was understanding good doctrine from the Bible. But because we had this piety that we also respected, there was dynamic tension there. And it was complicated for me because as a teenager, I felt I was on my way out of Christianity altogether. And I ended up having this very powerful spiritual experience that had kind of all the classic elements of a mystical, adolescent mystical awakening. So that's always been there in my life. But I have to say, it was Richard Rohr's fusion of those two words, action and contemplation, that gave me permission, I think, to feel like, oh, it's okay to care about both of these things.
Mm-hmm. You're an and contemplative. Like the and is central to your contemplative posture.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I actually respect and honor and celebrate people whose their life is 90% called to contemplation. The world's a better place for that. And on the other side too. But yeah, I've felt I want to hold those two together.
Yeah. I so love that because that sense for me of like the multiplicity of different types of contemplatives or different types of Christians or different types of spiritual believers just adds to the riches of conversation and hopefully of movements to be transformative partners in the world. Like I think about Wendell Berry calling himself a forest Christian.
Yes.
Now, I just love that because I love Wendell Berry's work and poetry and his activism, but it all comes out of that like forest Christianity and knowing that there's different locales and places from different religious streams, but that they are animated to tend to the work that is theirs to do from a very deep embodied place. And so I appreciate your naming that.
As you say that, I think there's something that happens in religion, and it's just part of our human rivalry and insecurity and all the rest. But we like to turn everything into a competition. I was so impressed. My older daughter, with her children, she taught them a little saying that she picked up somewhere. Comparison is the thief of joy. Your cookie's bigger than mine. So now I stop enjoying my cookies. So she taught her children when they were very small, and she would say, "What is comparison?" And they would say, "The thief of joy." But they got the message, right? And I learned from them that it's one of the things, who has more Bible knowledge than someone else, who has said more rosaries than someone else, who has gone on more contemplative retreats than someone else, who spends longer time in a sit than someone else. And I just think it's something, life is so much better when we aren't stealing joy through comparison.
Yeah. Yes. I was talking to one of my favorite songwriters, Jeffrey Martin, about how there's nothing more beautiful than a circle of contemplatives together. And sometimes there's nothing more pretentious when all of a sudden like people start playing these games of like, oh, I do 3 sits a day or whatever it might be. And the way that shows up in spiritual circles actually detracts from what I see as the beauty of everyone's unique. Like Tessa Bilecki says that to be a contemplative is not unique. Every person is a unique type of contemplative. And I believe that wholeheartedly. So we don't have to compare. We don't have to play those games. I'm going to steal that from your daughter and use that with my kids because I think that is an incredible, the cookie thing is legit and real, not just the contemplative level. Brian, I would love to know too, if someone were going to teach a class on the formation of Brian McLaren, what would be the 3 mandatory works, the readings, art, places that formed you that would definitely be on that syllabus?
Yes. So I love that question when I hear you ask it to other people, and I'm totally unprepared for that question. So let me just go totally
Yes.
off the cuff. So my first honest reaction, I think, is to tell you 3 pieces of music. When I was a teenager, I always loved music. I started playing piano and woodwinds. I played violin. Then I picked up guitar, became a singer-songwriter. And of course, all the great singer-songwriters of my coming of age years in the early 70s, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Carole King, James Taylor, they were all sort of major part of my life. But I also picked up the saxophone and I was in a jazz ensemble. So the first thing I would say is I would pick a piece of jazz. A song that I remember our little jazz ensemble played was called In the Mood by Glenn Miller. So that song has a certain kind of delight and joy and playfulness that has meant a lot to me. Then probably the next piece I would pick, when I was in college, I was dating a woman who I was in her dorm room once, and she had this record. These were back in the days of LPs. She had a record on her record player with improvised piano music, and I was just amazed. And she just took the record off the turntable, stuck it in the sleeve. It was a multi-album set, and gave it to me and said, "Here, you can have it." And it
Wow.
was Keith Jarrett's Colne concert. And I
No kidding.
remember the improvisation and the beauty and the groans that come through on the microphone, that I probably listened to those 4 improvised pieces more than any other single piece of music through my life. I don't know. I can't explain why it moves me so much and stays with me, but that would be another. And then a third, I would have to pick a song by Bruce Cockburn, whose music has kind of been an accompaniment to my life. And if I were to pick one song, I think it would be Fascist Architecture.
Ah,
Yeah. So those would be that's what comes to mind. Yeah. I mean, if
I
I
love
started
that.
with books, I couldn't stop because books,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I know wild places too. If you start with one place, you probably go to many
Yes.
as well. I appreciate you leaning into the music there. It's fun to see that progression. And I was reminded of what you're talking about the Keith Jarrett album. There's this Lyle Lovett song. Oh, actually, it's a Guy Clark song that Lyle Lovett, I think, has
Mm,
perfected, but it's called Step Into This House. And there's this line about this book of poetry that means so much to him that he got from a woman that he loves, but
mm,
who he no longer is in love with, but the book like still carries on.
mm,
Like the love
mm.
that was in that relationship has
Yes.
carried on through that, even though that relationship is over. And I couldn't help but think of that song as you were talking about that
Yeah.
album of just these little gifts that we don't know that pop up in the midst of relationships, some that go on for a long time, others that are for a season. And that here you are now looking
Yes.
back, and that record still has that place in your formation.
Yeah. I am sure. I mean, part of it was she could tell that I was just enchanted by the music. And she was very kind to me and she cared about me and she gave me the album. And I guess, yeah, part of, I'm sure, the magic of the music for me is that it was such a kind gift from a really sweet human being.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you had a birthday recently. Is that correct?
May the fourth be with you. Yes, that's my.
I love that. And I neglected to wish you happy birthday. So let me just say happy birthday now, a few weeks later. And I'd love to ask, and this is a tradition a lot of people have, but on or near someone's birthday to ask them birthday questions. And in our little family, we ask, what did you learn this past year? And what do you hope to learn in this next year of life? And you can go as light or as deep as you want in that response, but what have you learned in this
Yes.
past year? And what do you hope to learn in this next year?
Well, I'm 68, and in this last year, I think keep learning that you never grow up and that you can be insecure in a 67-year-old way or 68-year-old way, just as you could be insecure in a 17-year-old way. And you can be dysregulated in a 67-year-old way, just as you can in a 37-year-old way. So I suppose that's something that I've had many reminders of this year. And something I hope to learn in the next year. I've told you I have this great love for fly fishing. And one of the things that happens as you get older is, especially something like fly fishing that has a certain amount of physical rigor to it, because trout tend to live in places that, well, I like to hike into the creeks and all the rest. So it takes some physical prowess and or physical energy and balance and so on. So one of the things about this love is that you never know how much longer you're going to be able to do it. A dear friend of mine, I was with him when he was around 80, and I was with him once we were fishing together, and we're on different parts of the stream, but trying to keep track of each other. And he has been losing his vision. He has macular degeneration, and I couldn't find him. And I spent, probably, it felt like 3 hours. It was probably 25 minutes running up and down the stream looking for him. And I was afraid he'd fallen in and got washed down. And eventually I couldn't think of any place else. I went back to the car, and he was sitting on a rock by the car weeping. And it was so sad. And he said, I just realized my eyes are so bad now. I can't tie a fly on. I can't tie a knot in my line. And that has stayed with me. And I think something I hope I learn is to give myself permission to do some of these things I enjoy while I still can. And to understand that there are times and seasons. And part of getting older for me, I think, also has this sense that, whether you know it or not, you'll come upon your lasts. The last time you do this, the last time you do that. So just trying to enjoy each thing, not knowing how many more chances you'll have to enjoy it.
Wow. That's brilliant and wise. And is this where you're intending to hope to learn this year as well? Or is there another thing you hope to learn in the coming year?
Well, I think that's something I want to keep learning.
Yeah.
I feel like, and there's a way it can go sour. There can be a kind of desperation to, I guess it's sort of it's a fear of missing out.
Yeah.
That can sort of, I think, also steal joy in a certain way, because then things are done out of a sense of pressure. So
right.
Navigating that at this stage of my life, there are many dimensions to it. The activist part of me has been so committed to changing the world in ways that seem important and meaningful. And, there are people who gracefully keep changing the world until they're in their 90s. I think of Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall, I just adore her.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are other people who you get the feeling, and she seems to do her work out of this deep passion and commitment, but not out of a kind of desperation.
Yeah.
And something else I pick up in people my age and older often is that there is a kind of work that gets done out of desperation. I didn't save the world yet. I didn't fix everything yet. I didn't solve this problem yet. And I don't want to go there. So I watch those competing options at work in my own psyche. And yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate hearing that. And then also just the natural challenge of living deeper into that.
Yeah.
As life presents itself anew with the 17-year-old version of ourselves who's still kicking and the 68-year-old version of yourself that's still emerging and curious and wants to
Yes.
grow.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough last year, this flashed in my mind as you were talking, to hear at the Santa Fe Literary Festival here, John Krakauer was in conversation with Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. And
Mm.
it was right after he had basically given Patagonia, so all profits went to
Yes.
environmental protection and climate
Yes.
crisis response. And so I've always already looked up to Yvon Chouinard, the way that he's lived this roughneck kind of life of having clear priorities about what matters to him.
Yes.
And the truth telling capacity of him at that age
Mm.
in a room full of wonderful people who were excited about what he was having to say, but the way he pushed back against capitalism and wealth accumulation as a way to justify one's existence was extraordinary, because you could
Wow.
hear in the audience people cheering at first about his climate work. And then when he challenged them on the way that they were making money, the claps got a little more sparse. But I just honored that. Like, he epitomizes to me
Yes.
somebody who's growing in generosity and curiosity and openness while enjoying the
Yes.
beauty of this world. So
Yes.
you reminded me of him in your response in
Mm.
that.
Well, it makes me curious. I want to go. Is that something you heard? You saw in person? I wonder if it's something
Yeah.
I'd be able to hear. Maybe it's recorded
I'll
somewhere.
see if I can find it. Because there are so many little life lessons in that.
Yes.
And one of the things that he talks about is how he wishes that everyone in their late teens or early 20s would have an experience of adventure that would scare them a little bit or kind of alter their sense of how they're relating to
Yes.
the world. And so your
Yes.
point about your own experience at that age with your kind of mystical awakening, like, these things alter us for the rest of our lives and become these
Yes.
touchstones. And he really leaned into that point, which I thought was a wonderful thing for all of us to hear, and to encourage younger people to really engage life in that moment, because it will mark the rest of your days.
Well, and of course, I'm even more curious to learn more about that from Yvon Chouinard, because he is a deep devotee of a very fascinating form of fly fishing called tenkara fishing. So, yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
My wish for your birthday this year is that somehow you and Yvon Chouinard get to bump each other and fish together, because that would be, the conversation would be so rich.
Oh, my goodness. That's amazing to imagine. Thank you.
This is a great lead in, I think, just thinking about Yvon and you to your latest book and
Mm.
the subject you're dealing with. The book,
Yes.
of course, is Life After Doom: Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And Brian, this is a powerhouse book. I thank you for writing it and inviting readers and your audience and your new audience and growing audience to engage with the planet and in this moment with very clear eyes.
Mm.
As a place of starting it, I want to ask you, just so folks have a sense of what this book is about.
Yes.
The title, of course, Life After Doom. What do you mean by doom? How are you defining that?
I'm having to define it for a lot of people. Some people who were raised in a religious tradition like me, when they think of doom, they think of biblical prophecies about the end of the world and that sort of thing, which I think are gross misunderstandings of the Bible. And it's certainly not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about doom as a psychological, spiritual, emotional experience that I have had and a number of people have had. And it involves seeing what we're doing to the world and to each other and getting a sense of how our world works and having this feeling that we're on this runaway train and we don't have confidence that we have the brakes to stop it before something very bad happens. And it's a feeling. And I think we're best when we acknowledge, it's best for us if we acknowledge it's not reality. We don't know what it is, but it is a feeling. And the feeling it's associated with for, I think, thousands and thousands more people every single day is what some people are calling our multi-crisis. And a multi-crisis or a polycrisis means that we have a set of discrete problems. Human beings always have problems, right?
Yeah.
We have a set of problems, but what happens when your problems, each of your problems makes the other problems harder to solve? So just to name a couple of those problems, climate change is a super urgent one. One of the weird things, we're all getting used to hearing headlines. Like it was 1 week ago it was about 10 days ago. There was a headline in The Guardian, and the headline in the UK, and the headline was that the vast majority of climate scientists think that we have already broken through the 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier, this barrier that the world's leading scientists set in Paris and what's called the Paris Accords. And governments of the world made commitments to keep us below 1.5. And basically, we haven't done enough. And so these scientists say that we've broken that barrier. Later that day, I saw that online, read the article. Later that day, I had the radio on. And so here is what I hear on the radio. The climate scientists say, da, da, da. Now for news on Taylor Swift. And what it felt like was the very act of putting those two stories next to each other evacuated the first problem of the seriousness. It was like, oh, and another piece of news, and another piece of news. So you take that environmental problem, which, to use a really bad pun, is the tip of the melting iceberg that's over a deeper problem called overshoot, meaning we take too many resources out of the earth for the earth to replenish, and we pump out too many waste products for the earth to detoxify. You take that problem and then you put it together. Let's just pick one other problem: the concentration of wealth among the super, super, super wealthy. And when wealth gets concentrated among the super wealthy, they use that wealth to buy politicians and bribe politicians through legally or illegally, and influence politicians. And not only that, they use that wealth. I know it's very hard for people to imagine a super wealthy billionaire buying a social media company so that he can put his messages out and then use the algorithms to amplify his voice so it has 2,000 times the power of anyone else's voice on the app, right? So then you think, if the richest people in the world who are super dependent on fossil fuels have more and more wealth and money and power and influence coming to them, and they amass more and more, how that makes it harder for us to solve that first problem. And then we could add any number of other problems. But when people feel that, there's this psychological experience. And here's what it does to some people. To some people, it breaks them. Mm-hmm. They have a kind of meltdown, breakdown that they never recover from, or it takes years from their life, right? Other people are so terrified by it, they swing to the opposite extreme and they go into a kind of desperate denial. Mm-hmm. And a whole lot of people are caught in the middle, and they think, how can I constructively metabolize this feeling that I'm having? And that's what I'm trying to do in the book. That's what I mean by the word doom.
Thank you, Brian. That's a wonderful summarizing of that with very concrete examples. Because I know I could put myself in the shoes of, in different seasons of my life, just feeling like the world is caving in as I was introduced to things like systemic injustice.
Yes.
White supremacy in our systems, as well as, cultural and ecological devastation.
Yes.
And I watched myself go through these cycles of
yes,
education that opens my eyes to overwhelm, to my own kind of internal collapse, and then having to face reality again and again. I think one of the gifts of this book is the way you invite readers to move in a gentle awakening so that they don't ever move too far. So the intention is not that it'll collapse on the reader, but to be continually awakened to the realities of our times. And you do this beautifully and masterfully in splitting into 4 parts. And I want to name these 4 parts where you say letting go, letting be, letting come, and setting free. So that's how you break up the book. And then there's a tagline to each of like letting go is a path of descent. Letting be is a place of insight. Letting come, a path of resilience. Setting free, a path of agile engagement. And why does it matter, do you think, that these 4 movements are included in this U-shaped journey with life and doom?
Yeah. Well, for people who explore the contemplative life, this idea of a descent into a dark night is deeply embedded. And there are so many reasons we could talk about why I think that's important. If I could talk about one specifically related to our situation that's becoming clearer and clearer to me. And I think some people who take the contemplative side of life seriously might resist what I'm about to say, because I think there's a certain approach to contemplation that says we're sinking into timeless and eternal truths. But what I'm about to say is very time bound. 150 plus years ago, human beings figured out they could burn coal, and they found out there was a whole lot of coal under the ground. And it fueled something called the Industrial Revolution. Then they found out, oh, you know what? There's also this stuff called oil that we can use. And there's this stuff we call natural gas that we can use, which, by the way, is its own kind of marketing slogan. Natural gas. Well, it's natural oil and natural coal too. I don't understand that. But what I realize more clearly now, I never realized it as deeply as I do from writing this book, is that to have been born after fossil fuels, as opposed to before fossil fuels, I think has changed the psyche of humanity. I think I'm looking back on my life and realizing I think like a fossil fuel human, fueled human, because it's given us power that we just take for granted. And it's made us feel like every problem can be solved. And it's just put our entire civilization on overdrive and given us this sense of eternal, unlimited progress. And part of the feeling of doom is when people become realistic that actually, no, that money party doesn't last forever. That energy party doesn't last forever. We're like some kids who found a whole bunch of money in their parents' sock drawer and have had a 150-year spending spree, not realizing that eventually that resource would run out. And then we have to figure out, can we keep living using that amount of energy and power? Are we willing to change? How big risks are we going to take to try to keep things going at that speed? And you put all of that together and you realize that human beings are going through something very much like an addictive process where we got addicted to something and we're in denial about our addiction. And this is why people who go through addiction recovery very, very often speak of it as a spiritual program of recovery, because there's a spirituality to acknowledging the mess we've gotten ourselves into. So, yeah.
Well said.
And I'll just say that descent process is like people going through the process of hitting bottom. And the bottom process is like that letting be process where we have to just sit in the acknowledgement of our powerlessness. And then something can come. And that's the returning to sanity, we might say. And so
That's beautiful. I think the example of addiction is so spot on. And I think there's a way in which that recognition is becoming popularized. And my wife has been a part of this climate crisis grief group where they use the 12 steps as a way to move through the acceptance, the surrendering,
Yes.
all the aspects that one would do in a 12-step program. And in my own new monastic community, we use the 12 steps as a pathway of transformation and vulnerability. And I love the way that Jim Finley says it, I'm not burdened or blessed to be a friend of Bill W., but that framework is so helpful for engaging in matters of the heart, of relationship, and planetary existence at this time because of our addiction to fossil fuels. And your point about being born after the normalization of fossil fuels as a given, that to me is a game changer. Of like, we're born with that, and especially in the States here, we're born with that assumption. And I'm just grateful whether you bring 12 steps as modality to look at reality with very clear eyes and to see a pathway of transformation.
And I think I suppose it's one of the reasons I really love your podcast, Paul, because it feels to me are trying to take complexity and put it on the lower shelf and make it available to people, and not try to make it esoteric, but make it ordinary and everyday and accessible and human. And I think people are going to need this. We are going to have to become contemplative in many different ways if we want to survive the transition period that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Amen to that.
And let me say, especially if we want to survive it with some degree of sanity and serenity and equilibrium, I think it'll be very, very easy to either find ourselves psychologically whiplashed into denial because we just don't like having to deal with some of the realities, or going into absolute despondency. And as you know from the book, one of the things I'm very suspicious of, because I watch my brain want to flip into everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the silver bullet that will solve all our problems. Or I flip into it's hopeless, it's too late, there's nothing we can do. And what both of those responses do is they, in a sense, surrender my own agency. Either other people will solve it, there's nothing I need to do, or nobody can solve it, there's nothing I need to do. And I lose my agency. And the more people who lose their agency in either of those ways increases the chance of worse outcomes. So, so that's why I feel this capacity for us to center ourselves and meet all the reality we can bear, and actually remind ourselves how easily we can fool ourselves, and try to counter that with a sincere prayer and desire to be people who face the truth. All of that, it seems to me, is not just a luxury. It really is a survival strategy.
Yeah. Yes. Amen. In that, like, I think about the ways in which we let ourselves off the hook at times, whether it's because we can't face it anymore, or we feel like it's impossible, that the necessity for periods of retreat and rest and joy in the midst of this work, because it allows us to discern further, like, what is mine to do? How have I gotten off course? And just play, to rest, to, like, even in the midst of all of this chaos and all the turmoil that we see, like, I can still hear the birds singing in the morning. I still get the chance to wrestle with my son. All these small things that I have to enjoy, but also set aside time to just rest.
Yes.
And I think looking at the cycles of the seasons, of the fallow season, that, like, you're not trying to harvest or plant, you're letting the land rest. And we are creatures of this planet, and we need the same thing. I was really moved by, there's a scene in your book where you're at a training with Sir John Houghton. I think I'm getting his name right. The
Houghton,
climate scientist, Houghton.
Yeah.
And he talks about the need for patience and urgency.
Yes.
In this work, if you're trying to invite others into seeing the reality of what's happening, and that it's not out of trying to scare someone, but trying to say, let's do this together, let's show up together.
Yes.
And him saying patient urgency, and that is a thread throughout your book, and you do it with such care. How do you hold that line of compassionate care with patient urgency in the midst of the needs of what's going on? How do you personally do that as a way of invitation for others to join you in holding that same compassionate care?
Yeah, well, so your question is assuming that I do.
You do for me, I'll say that.
I think I do sometimes. And I think one of the reasons I do sometimes is because I hate how it feels when I don't. So the fact that I am, to whatever degree I'm doing it, means that I'm also not doing it, and I don't like how it feels, so I return to it. It doesn't come automatically for me. And what you were saying about rest and joy, it's so important. There's a chapter in the book it's called Beauty Abounds, and it's just this, I need those words, beauty abounds, to remind me to keep noticing the beauty, because there's abounding ugliness too. I mean, we have a world where fascism is making a comeback and many members of our government seem to kind of like it. And
right.
So you can just be focused on the ugliness so that you're in a perpetual state of outrage. And the irony of that is, when you're in a perpetual state of outrage, it turns us into the kind of people who nobody wants to be around. And if the people who are paying attention to our real problems, nobody wants to be around, they're actually, it's not going to help us address our problems. So I think a quote that I stumble upon that I really should memorize, but from the blessed Robin Wall Kimmerer, she says, even though the world is being wounded by our human activity, it continues to give us joy. And to not appreciate that joy, to not rejoice when the earth gives you joy, is another way of ignoring the earth. And ignoring the beauty of the earth is one of the things that got us into this mess. So I'm feeling this. I feel like a little kid, Paul. One of my neighbors up the street, I live in Southwest Florida, so it's a subtropical climate, although for this time of year it feels super tropical. But he has a beautiful lychee tree. And the way lychee trees grow here, they don't get fruit every year. We need a certain number of cool nights in order for lychee trees here to get fruit. His tree is covered in fruit. And if a lot of folks maybe have never eaten lychee fruit, but it's kind of like a magical giant grape. It's really, really delicious. And it has this thorny skin or prickly skin, and inside is something so sweet and soft. It's delicious. So he was heading out of town and he said, Brian, I'm going out of town. The lychee tree is at maximum ripeness. Please don't let him go to waste. Go take all you can. So I have been indulging in lychees and feeling the joy of the world, nature, this beautiful living planet pours out joy for us. And for us to not rejoice is tragic. And I think people don't often realize there is contemplative joy. There are times in contemplation where we just bubble out in laughter and we feel the joy of being alive, what the Bible calls the joy of the Lord. That is our real strength. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Thank you for that example. Like that to me is, it's one of those nutritious little snacks that we get on this hard hike of life right now. Like we need those pauses and celebration together. And the eruption of joy, I think, is a prayer in itself. And to not dismiss that as secondary, so I appreciate you centering that as well. There's another piece I want to talk to you about in regards to hope, because there's different approaches to hope, and sometimes it gets this naive, romanticized version of, and it's a temptation for all of us. I think you've named it, I've named it, like, maybe everything will just turn out okay. Maybe there'll be something, and it pacifies us in a way where we kind of go back to sleep and don't see our own co-participation in the planet. How have you complexified your definition of hope through writing this book?
Yeah. First, I have a chapter on this in the book called Hope is Complicated. And I begin by saying that I've always been very devoted to hope because when I was a teenager, I had a sort of my first baptism into depression.
Mm.
I wasn't hospitalized. I didn't need medication, but I spent the better part of 2 years with this feeling that the abyss was falling out from under my feet. The abyss was opening under my feet. And I'm an upbeat person. I'm a cheerful person by nature, I think. But I've had serious brushes with deep, deep sadness. And so the idea of hope as looking on the bright side and not getting sucked into discouragement, super important to me. And it's been a big part of my life to try to emphasize the value of hope. In recent years, I met a gifted, wonderful research psychologist who spent his career, among other things, studying hope. And it's just an indicator of well-being. It is so, so, so important. Like, it makes me feel how important it is to teach children the skills of hope and the skills of learning to encourage yourself and find encouragement from others. So hope is this beautiful thing. And despair or despondency can be this paralyzing, life-stealing thing. And that's why I think a lot of people are surprised when I wrote a chapter called Hope is Complicated. But nobody put it more powerfully for me than the theologian Miguel de la Torre, who said he was walking through the gates of Auschwitz on a tour with some other theologians. And the sign above the gate that was there during World War II and the Nazis were committing genocide, the words were, "Work will set you free." And so Auschwitz wasn't called a death camp, even though that's what it was. It was called a labor camp. And so all the Jews and gypsies and gay people and others who were being shipped into these camps, the promise that was made to them, have hope. If you work hard, you'll be set free. And he said that was a lie. It used hope to exploit the people even further. And I think when we face that other people can exploit us and we can fool ourselves by saying, oh, it'll all be fine, it'll all be fine. So hope is beautiful. And like every beautiful thing, we can become over-dependent on a certain kind of shallow hope. And in some ways, what this book is about for me is realizing that shallow hope won't help me survive. I'm going to need a much deeper hope. And what Joanna Macy calls an active hope.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to read this quote from Miguel just because I think it's so powerful. Of hope is what is fed to those who are being slaughtered, so they won't fight what is coming. Yeah. And that is that shallow hope, and exercising a deep hope, an active hope that is not dependent on the conditions of. It's a different beast. It's a different texture to it. You know, you name the 4 parts of the book as these kind of like mantras that you've distilled. There's a lot there, and you've distilled them down these lines. And then you also name throughout the book these other mantras. You say like, welcome to reality, mind your mind, we're all candles. And I find this really helpful because I'm a person who tries to memorize little bits of like a line of poetry or a line like this that like carries the whole weight of a book behind it, or a thought or a conversation.
Yes.
What is it about one-line mantras that you think are useful for engaging in this type of work with the world? And if it's helpful, like if there's any one of those that helps to unpack or expound on,
Mm.
what is it about one of those particular mantras that you carry with you and why you engage with it the way you do?
Yes. Yes. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the ways I think the contemplative life works, there's more going on than just this, but I think the contemplative life is a life where we mind our mind. We realize that we have this complicated apparatus of consciousness. We used to think it was just the brain. Now we understand, no, the, our whole being is integrated in ways that we were naive about before. But we have this apparatus of consciousness, and it's very complex, and it's not perfect, and it's evolved at different levels, different parts of our apparatus, our equipment. And we have, some of us are lucky enough. I think I want to use the word lucky. We just happen to get a set of apparatus that hums along very well. Our brains and our nervous system is just nicely tuned and works just fine. Others of us, we have all kinds of things working in our nervous system that are really, really hard to manage. I have never been a super anxious person, but I am very close to some people who anxiety just haunts them every moment, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You just realize we don't all have the same apparatus to work with. And learning how to manage our own bodies and emotions and thoughts and decision-making processes is a really, really big deal. And one of the ways in contemplation that it seems helps people do this is by focusing and then releasing. So we find something to focus on that helps us, instead of our thoughts running off in 1,000 different directions, we find something to focus on. And that's what a little mantra can be. So one of the mantras in the book is maybe it's good, maybe it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we tend to do is throw everything into a good or bad bin. And if it's good, we relax. And if it's bad, we're uptight. Sometimes we relax when we shouldn't relax. And sometimes we're uptight when we shouldn't be uptight. So a little mantra, if I can focus on maybe it's good, maybe it's not, it helps me hold that tension, helps me see that. And if I can hold it long enough that I feel it's now becoming part of me, I can then relax and almost trust that to be part of me and enjoy that kind of peace of an open awareness and a resting in divine love, however we want to express it. So that's one of the reasons I think those little kind of mantras are valuable. And people who grew up like you and I did, in Christian contexts where we were taught to memorize scriptures, sometimes what that involved was these little phrases that really would give us balance and something to hold on to when we felt we were dysregulated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate the acknowledgement of the different apparatuses we all carry. And,
Yes.
if we had more time, we'd go into the committees that you mentioned, the brain. I think that was brilliant. And that we all show up differently with these different apparatuses and nervous systems. And so we have we can cultivate mindful skills, and we can cultivate practices and mantras. And also it leans into me the sense of like the need for community, and that I don't have to do it alone. Like a very small example, our dear mutual friend and colleague, Mike Petro, we are very different personalities, but there's times where his spark can ignite me and help me kind of get off my haunches. And there's times where my kind of more laid back demeanor can help him bring in this more sense of peace. But and that's just a small example, but to me, that is the embodiment of communal learning and giftedness that I guess, what we would call the mystical body of Christ in Christian language, where it's not up to us alone, but we can have these skill sets to help contain ourselves and also flourish, but also, I can't do everything. I need you, Brian, and I need other friends, and I need Muslim friends. I need Buddhist friends. I need this cacophony of riches that is found in the religious traditions. So it doesn't become too small and flattened. If there's anything I've learned by looking at this planet, is that biodiversity is when life flourishes, and it's unpredictable, but life precedes life and expands life.
Yes.
So I would love to hear any thoughts on the necessity for different folks to show up in their own embodiments, their own particular locations, for how they can be in service to this burgeoning movement to be healers of the planet by participating deeply. Any thoughts on an invitation you have? Maybe I'll back up for a second and say, your book is such a wonderful way of immersing in the problem, the different perspectives on the problem, and ways of engagement. And so there's tons of practical resources in there that I really want to invite folks to read the book and see what calls to them. From that place in your book, is there any particular resource that you think, because you have like reflections, ideas of discernment, that you would point people to as particularly poignant for somebody who is unsure about how to step into being a healing presence in the world in this way?
Well, let me just pick up on what you were just saying about how it's tough enough that we're trying to regulate ourselves. And sometimes we can't. We don't have the power to get ourselves in a peaceful or constructive or non-outraged or non-reactionary state, right? And that's where one of the chapters in the book is, the little mantra is, it only takes two or three. You get together with a couple of other people, and we really can help one another balance. Hey, Paul, I wonder if I can tell you an experience. It's something I've noticed, and I'd love to hear if you've ever noticed this.
Yeah.
Because I'm pretty sure this happens. So let's say I'm driving, and I ask and my wife's in the passenger seat, and we brought sandwiches along, and I asked her to give me a sandwich. So what I notice is she unwraps the sandwich and gets it ready, and then she hands it to me. And when I look down at the sandwich, she's looking at the road. Like, it's almost like, without realizing it, we're both in a situation where our bodies align. And if I'm distracted, she's paying more attention. And I'm just amazed at how you get two people together and we know how to sync up. Have you noticed that too when you're driving?
What a great example. Yes, 100%. I can't tell you the number of road trips where we've had that exact same exchange.
Yeah. Like, to me, it's part of what I call in the book our survival committee, this deeply evolved part of us that knows that we can wire our brains together and we are compensating for each other. And I think it's just one of the blessings of friendship and partnership and community, that we help each other. So let's say I'm really revved up and angry about something, and you're really revved up and angry about something, and we get together and we just feed the fire. But I'll bet that eventually one of us is going to say, yeah, but we got to be careful we don't overdo it here, right? Yeah. We'll have the instinct to help regulate. Among friends, that is a deep, deep, precious treasure that we need. And I think we're going to need it more than ever going forward. If we don't find those kinds of friendships where we can speak the truth and try to balance each other and help each other keep in balance, we have to be aware that there are other people, authoritarians, con artists, who what they will do is they will use our disequilibrium. Just like they can manipulate hope, they can manipulate anger, they can manipulate fear, they can manipulate shame. And any of us who've been around the religious world very long have seen a good bit of this because a lot of it happens in religious communities. But it can happen in every dimension of life. And that's where the subversiveness of a few people who learn how to compensate for each other and balance together, I think it's a priceless gift.
Yes. That's so well said, Brian. And the art of noticing, starting with that example of the sandwiches in the road
Mm.
and that symbiotic relationships that emerge for the benefit of the travelers, and the ways that can be abused if that disequilibrium is noticed by someone seeking undue power. I'm reminded, funnily enough, of primates where when how they groom each other as a way of intimacy, but also as a way of cleanliness. And as the group became too big, laughter and singing became like the next evolutions of how you share group intimacy. And I think about that as ways to celebrate and connect with one another. But then I think it can tip into something different, where if you choose to laugh at someone rather than laugh together, or that there's a moment of exploitation that can happen by someone seeking power over a group. And I think we see that in our own times of it creates an us and them and otherizes peoples and places where, to use that old primate mindset of like, I want to be a part of the group laughing, so let's laugh at them because they're not laughing at me. And it becomes another layer of separation for the cohesion of a group that seeks domination rather than a group that seeks cohesion and laughter for the joy of intimacy. Like there's nothing better than that pure laughter because you're enjoying one another's company. You're laughing with and not at. And so it's a bit of a diversion in that thought, but it came to mind as a very primal example of how we operate that way.
I'm so glad you bring that up because I think we've all had the experience. There are certain comedians who, in a sense, they're like shamans. They get us together and they get us laughing at ourselves. They get us not taking ourselves so seriously. And to be in a room full of people who are laughing, and there's purgation in it. It's a purgative kind of experience. There's illumination in it because we have these sparks of insight about how silly we are. And, that's quite humbling in it. And there might be this sort of surrender to a deeper unity. Like, we're all a mess. We're all ridiculous. We're all wonderful. We're all beloved. In a strange way, the comedian plays the role of a spiritual guide. I've certainly experienced this. Obviously, as you say, there are others who just rile us up in ways that might not be helpful, but there are those who do that for us. And it's who would have guessed that there would be this deep spiritual work of purgation, illumination, and union going on in a comedy club?
Yeah, and I feel like there's a book there for someone to write on that pathway with comedy as the instigator.
Yeah.
Brian, I could talk to you for hours about life after doom, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in so many ways. I recommend that everyone read Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. It is a game changer. It can really change your life on how you approach doom, collapse, and how you can participate in the healing of the world. I think there's so much beauty in this book and a deeper invitation. And Brian, I always like to close by asking the guest, if you were going to pair this conversation with Life After Doom with a drink, what would be your drink of choice and why?
So I was thinking about this because this is a lot of pressure. I'm just kidding.
You don't want to get this one wrong.
Yeah, and I love this in your in Contemplify. But it would be a black and tan, which for people who don't know is if you take half a Guinness and half a lager and you mix them together. I was just with a friend the other night, and we each had a black and tan together. And the reason I think it's appropriate for this conversation is there is a sort of a dark beer element to some of the things we're talking about. But there is something when that darkness gets mixed with light that is a very life-giving and alive thing. So I would have us raise a glass of black and tan.
Perfect. I cannot wait for the next time we can clink a black and tan together, because that is so true. Well said. Thank you for listening to this slow-cooked episode of Complexify. May its delights spark wonder, and may any sour patches be sweetened by their folly. Head over to Complexify.com to find the show notes for this episode, sign up for the monthly Complexify non-required reading list, and also the weekly contemplative practice, Lo-Fi and Hushed. If you are enjoying Complexify, rate and review it on your podcast player. The internet tells me this helps spread the contemplative cheer. The theme song for Complexify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, thanks as always. And of course, I am looking forward to bringing you more musings and more conversations with contemplatives kindling the examined life in the world. Until then, be well.